that rings a lot of bells, because that's really where Reformed theology flows from. It's the exaltation of the sovereignty of God and the uniqueness of the saving work of Christ. And once you understand that fact about Reformed theology, the whole process becomes clear. And the reason I think Peter Toon attaches puts this second in his book, is he wants everyone to understand where he's going to go from there in the discussion of justification by grace through faith, his discussion of the sufficiency of Christ, and so on and so forth. And this really got me reflecting on the, for want of a better term, the Protestant side of Anglicanism. Anglicanism is probably unique in the sense that it puts a great deal of stress on being both Catholic and, as Peter Toon says, evangelical, and as I would say, Reformed. And the reason for this is we really do have two inheritances. The first one is the one that we receive from the medieval church. The English Reformation was extremely drawn out. The break with Rome is 1533. There isn't actually a code of canon law issued until 1604. And the standard translation of the Bible doesn't appear until 1611, although, of course, there's been the Bishop's Bible, the Matthew's Bible, the Genevan translation, all before that. So what you have is a period of about 70 years where a series of compromises or settlements are reached. The first one is good old Henry's, well, I'm a Catholic, but on condition I'm my own Pope. The second is the very rapid reform under Edward VI, whereby they go from the Latin Mass to a strongly reformed communion service in a mere 4 years. Then, of course, Mary I sticks the brakes on, all the dust and loose material goes straight up in the air, tries to turn the clock back 22 years, and we have 5 years of persecution and confusion. Then we have Elizabeth, who reverts largely to the religious policy of her brother Edward. The interesting thing about this, and statistically something that one of my tutors, Robert Whiting, brought out, was just how much continuity there is there. A lot of the same people are in the same parishes in 1560 as they were in 1540. So, when the Puritans complained about dumb dog preachers and half papists and all the other insults they used to throw at the established clergy, there's a lot of truth to them, because there is a great turnover of personnel. You also have to remember that the last bishop to be consecrated on a papal warrant is also the first one to profess himself to be reformed, which of course is Thomas Cranmer. So you have a situation there in England where a lot of the institutions of the church continue all the way through the Reformation, and quite often with the same guy occupying the post. So there's a very real sense in which the institutional church remains very little change through the Reformation. The big changes are all in readopting Augustinian theology. So you have the particular emphases of the reformers: grace alone, faith alone, Scripture alone, Christ alone, to God alone be the glory. This comes through very clearly in the first prayer book, the second prayer book, the books of homilies. So you have a church which on the one hand preserves the core of the Catholic faith, the Scriptures, the creeds, the two great sacraments of baptism and Holy Communion, It preserves the episcopate. It preserves the adherence to the teaching of the first four general councils. There's a lot of continuity there in terms of teaching, as well as personnel. But it also embraces the new concepts that come out of the Reformation. And the whole purpose of Reformation theology is to exalt Christ. Because in the later Middle Ages, the ethos of the Catholic Church had moved away from a tight focus on the person and saving work of Christ to a theology which is much more like, well, you have, Christ over here, and in order to get to Christ, you have to go through the priest or the saints. There's a lot of intermediaries put between the believer and Christ. And this is something that the reformers are very keen to sweep away. I mean, it's no accident that Luther, who sparks the explosion that we call the Reformation, was someone who came from the Augustinian friars. He was someone who had already learned, albeit within the context of late medieval theology, just how central to Western Christendom the teaching of Augustine of Hippo was. So when he compares the over-anxious monk that he was, he's sent to Wittenberg basically on the kill or cure program to teach scripture, in the hopes that by teaching scripture he'll actually come to understand the major insights of the New Testament. And of course you have the legend about the tower experience and various other things in Luther's spiritual formation that led him to adopt a clearly Augustinian line on issues such as justification, sanctification, the relationship between grace and works. All of this isn't something that's new with Luther. Luther gives it a radical twist because, in a sense, he's the first one to write about it in German. And having done that, he brings theological ideas which have been the province of scholars for probably 500 years, if not longer, into the public arena. And I think the thing that really drove the papacy crazy about Luther was not so much initially what he was teaching, but the fact that what had been, a scholarly debate that didn't affect the cash register is suddenly put out in pamphlet form so that anybody with the rudiments of late medieval High German could read this stuff. And this was a revolution. You also have to remember, at the same time as Luther was scribbling away in Wittenberg, you also have Zwingli in Zurich reaching much the same conclusion. So you have, two related but distinct movements: the Reformed Church in Zurich, the beginnings of Evangelical Lutheranism in Saxony, both bringing to the fore this old Augustinian theology that had been neglected for several hundred years. The reason it all came to the forefront in such a spectacular way, and I think we tend to underestimate that today, is that it was just the right set of circumstances. There was enough opposition between the emperor and the German princes that they were inclined to defend someone who was one of their own, who was expressing ideas that they found useful. Secondly, you have the printing press. When Wycliffe made his protest, when Jan Hus made his protest, everything had to be laboriously copied by hand or laboriously carved into a wooden block and printed off that way. You have movable type. editions of Luther's pamphlets could be produced quickly. And as Luther was very good at turning out relatively short theological tracts, they could be printed from secret presses, movable presses. It was no longer possible for the institutional church to control the dissemination of literature. And so when Luther protests against indulgences and the whole mechanistic, works-based theory of sanctification that was so much part of the late medieval Catholic Church, they don't have a way of shutting him down real easily. And his ideas spread. Zwingli's ideas spread because they got into print. And so what you have to understand is that England is not an isolated Reformation, as so often church historians have tried to portray it as being, but rather it is fully part of a Northern European movement. And you're really given the clue to this by the picture that the old school biographers of Thomas Cranmer used to draw of this little circle of folks meeting in the White Horse Inn, sharing the new literature that has come from Germany. And it was relatively easy to smuggle stuff into Cambridge. Cambridge is close to the East Coast. King's Lynn, which is probably 35 miles to the north, was a major port trading with Lower Saxony, Hamburg, Bremen, Altona, Amsterdam, anything that came down the Rhine, anything that came out of northern Germany could get to Cambridge easily. And these ideas soak in to the theological dialogue in England. So although Henry keeps the brakes on until 1547, eventually the new ideas have to come through, particularly once they receive government approval in the form of Edward VI's regents. And what you have is actually quite interesting, because Cranmer, I think, had been preparing for a much fuller Reformation for about 10 years before it actually happened. And so what you have is a lot of work being done very quickly. You have the appearance of the Order of Communion, you have the first prayer book, you have the ordinal, you have various sets of articles for preachers, injunctions that swiftly but gradually move England from traditional Catholicism to a Reformed church. But whilst this is happening, it's still Sir Martin is the parson in your parish, and he's following the policy as it comes down to him from the king and the bishops. And this is why Anglicanism develops this unique dual identity, with one foot in the primitive Catholic Church and the other foot very firmly in the intellectual world of the Continental Reformation of the early 16th century. England is almost unique. The closest parallel is Sweden. Sweden's Reformation also is a situation where the last papally mandated consecration of a bishop leads to the first Lutheran archbishop, and again, this same process of continuity through the survival of the institution that you have in England. The difference in Sweden is that they identified very strongly with the Lutheran camp. Calvinism got up there during the reign of, I hope I've got the regnal number right, Charles III, and it produced a reaction against it. So the Synod of Uppsala in 1593 produces a reaction against Calvinism and finally defines the Protestant church in Sweden as being Lutheran. In England, the process is less involved in a way, because Elizabeth's reign froze the situation. The church that came into being between 1559 and 1571 remains in place throughout the rest of her reign. And although you've got the Puritan peanut gallery criticizing the church from the edges, firstly, what you have to realize about Puritanism under Elizabeth is very, very little of it was separatist. Separatism really is a tiny, tiny minority of those who would have been described as the hotter sort of Protestant, Precisians, Puritans during the period. Most 17th century Puritans, 16th century Puritans, sorry, were beneficed clergymen of the Church of England, whose non-conformity consisted of things like not bothering to wear the surplice every Sunday, leaving out the use of the cross in baptism, hoping for an introduction of some sort of presbytery alongside the bishops. They wanted further reform, not a revolution, not a replacement of the Elizabethan Church. And this traditionalism, and of course you have to remember that Calvin himself was not opposed to bishops. And you have to remember that this traditionalism, alongside the new theology, is what really fed the unique identity of Anglicanism. Yes, it's a Reformed church, but it's also a continuation of the ancient Catholic Church. On the one side, we can talk about the ideas of Luther, Calvin, Bucer, Bullinger, Aquinas, what we inherit from the Continental Reformation. On the other hand, we can point to the historical continuity with the Church of the Venerable Bede, of Augustine of Canterbury, and in the case of the Celtic fringe, back into the primitive British church that existed whilst the Romans ruled, or at least thought they ruled, the lowlands of Britain. So that is where the dual identity comes from, this slow Reformation. And the main thought that preoccupied 16th century theologians, particularly on the reforming side, was the need to exalt the saving work of Christ. So although the five solas is a relatively recent way of gathering together the main ideas of the Reformation, the actual theology that lies behind it goes back to 1517, 1521. And behind 1517 to 1521, it goes back to Augustine. And what it does, first and foremost, is put the responsibility for man's salvation firmly on the shoulders of God. That may be a strange way of expressing it, but this is the exact opposite of late medieval theology, which, being works-based, tended to put the onus for man's salvation on the individual. You had to go to Mass. You had to say your prayers. You paid to get souls out of purgatory. You followed the rules. It was a theology which, although, if you scraped enough layers of paint away, you got back to ideas like justification by grace through faith. They were so overlaid by cultus that most people could not perceive what was actually there. And a lot of the iconoclasm of the Reformation was a physical expression of scraping away all these layers of paint that had been slapped over the basic doctrines of the church. No longer did you have, visually, when you came into the church, the saints as intercessors for the exalted Christ, who appears not as a figure of compassion, but as a figure of judgment above the chancel arch. Instead, you have a rather bare church, a church in which the main visual interest is commanded by the pulpit, symbolizing the word, and by the communion table, symbolizing the Lord's Supper, in which we encounter Christ through the gifts of bread and wine, and the font, which is the means by which we are brought into a covenant relationship with God. And the deliberate elimination of most other symbols in the church was done to focus people's attention on the written and the spoken word and the basic doctrines of the church. No longer could they take refuge, as it were, in the cultus of the saints. Because I think the medieval mind had fallen into the idea that if you could get enough saints on your side, you could get into heaven. And it was a very much a case of Christ was perceived as the judge, his mother was perceived as the great intercessor, and along with her, the saints. And it's not a biblical picture of Christianity. And this is why so much emphasis was laid on the English Reformation on getting things into English. The first genuine reforming move of the English Reformation is putting the Bible into English. Because Henry's smash and grab raid on the monasteries was not a reforming move. That was a move to strengthen the financial position of the monarchy. The actual break with Rome was a means to an end. Henry wanted an annulment. The Pope couldn't give him an annulment because politically he was controlled by the emperor. So Henry ended up annulling the Pope instead. The first genuine reforming move is that English Bible. And when you look at the amount of trouble that Sir Thomas More went to ensure that it wasn't, unsuccessfully of course, that it wasn't completed or published, you realize how significant it was in the minds of men at the time to have an English Bible or not have an English Bible. To someone like Thomas More, the English Bible was the beginning of the end. I think Thomas More understood as well as anyone the impact of the common man being able to read the scriptures. And as a defender of the old order, he didn't want it to happen. Cranmer, as a defender and propagandist for the new religion, saw that the Bible was a relatively non-controversial way of getting people to see the glory of God as revealed in Scripture. This is why the publication of the English Bible in 1537-38 is so important. It marks the point at which, with the Scriptures now available in English, a broader range of religious ideas were accessible to the common man. The mere fact that Henry VIII ordered the Bible to be put in every church meant that there were now 11,000 Bibles freely accessible to the general public in England. And this was a revolution. You can't underestimate what a change that was to the medieval period, where you either had the faulty Lollard translation of the Vulgate, which you hid for fear somebody might turn you into the authorities and get you burnt as a heretic, or alternatively, you had to know Latin, you had to go through the university system, you had to be part of the theological establishment to be allowed to study Scripture. That's why the English Bible is such a revolution. The next big revolution, so far as English religion is concerned, is English in the liturgy. And Cranmer's a little bit cunning about this. he does it initially in a very non-controversial way. Henry VIII needed to win his war with France, and one of the things that often used to happen in in the early modern period is when there was a war on, there used to be days of prayer and humiliation, asking for God's favor. And the litany was originally composed as a form of prayer for precisely such occasions. And Cranmer's litany is a masterful piece of blending. In some respects, the original version is quite traditional. For instance, he retains, at least initially, a limited number of invocations of the Blessed Virgin Mary and the saints. But otherwise, it relates to Luther's litany. It's all in English. It's the first time for centuries the people have heard part of the church service in a language they could understand, other than the prayers that immediately surrounded the sermon on the odd occasions one was preached. And then from there, Cranmer follows a very well-planned path, introducing English into the office by asking for a chapter of the Old Testament and a chapter of the New Testament to be read during the breviary offices, then into the Eucharist through the order of communion, and then finally he brings forth a relatively traditional prayer book in 1549, then a fully reformed one in 1552. It's a four-stage process. Basically, you can accuse Cranmer of, inserting the camel into the tent on this one. I mean, it's clearly his methodology. The camel gets its nose into the tent with the English litany, and then over the next 10 years, the rest of the camel follows. And at that point, Cranmer has reformed the liturgy. But it's still a liturgical church. Another little myth that comes up about continental Protestantism is that the continental reformers abandoned liturgy. No. The records of the Reformation are littered with liturgical forms. You have, and this is just off the top of my head, you have the Formula Missae in 1523 from Luther, the German Mass in 1526. Zwingli publishes what is actually quite a conservative revision of the Mass in 1525. You have Capito's Liturgy for Strasbourg in 1525. You have Butz's in 1532. You have Brentz's Liturgy for Württemberg in 1533, and so it goes on through the Reformation. All of the Reformed churches of the mid-16th century are liturgical, even the Dutch Reformed. In fact, the Dutch Reformed liturgy is one of the longest lasting. You have the Palatine Liturgy of 1563. So, the Reformation was liturgical, another mark of continuity with the past. The sort of hymn and a thing form of worship that we so much associate with American Protestantism today is really a product of rationalism and revivalism. It doesn't relate to the old Protestantism at all. And the death of liturgy in much of the Protestant world is related precisely to that period between 1720 and 1820, where you have the influences of revivalism or pietism and rationalism running rampant. The tendency of rationalism is to eliminate all mystery. The tendency of revivalism or pietism is to exalt emotion. And the traditional forms did not fit well with that approach to religion, because it upset the delicate balance between the Catholic and the evangelical impulses that was so characteristic of the old Protestant churches. You see, the Church of England's not alone in this. Lutherans very much conceived themselves as being evangelical Catholics. Although you don't see the expression very often, Calvin conceived himself as being a reformer of the Catholic Church, not starting a whole new church. And on this basis, you have to look at the inheritance of Anglicanism, which places great stress even today on being Catholic and Reformed, as being part of this broader Protestant movement. The problem with expressing ideas like that in Anglicanism today is, of course, after Pietism and rationalism, you get Romanticism, which is the next big movement in the arts and in religion in Europe. And some of the products of the Romantic period, such as the recovery of traditional liturgical forms in Germany, strangely enough through that rationalistic creature, the Prussian Union Church, is one of the positive benefits of the 19th century Romantic movement. On the other hand, you get a general further loosening of traditional religious forms in favor of things which were more appealing. There's also a shift in the 19th century between a society that is production orientated towards a society which is consumption orientated. If you look at Europe in the early 19th century, it is still predominantly engaged in farming and small industry. By the end of the century, it is predominantly urban, predominantly industrial, and the connection with the land has been broken. People increasingly consume goods rather than produce them. And this produces a subtle shift in the way in which people react to religion. The religion of the 17th and 18th centuries is, in many respects, very results orientated. What do I need to do in order to be acceptable before God? And it's very much a spiritual and an intellectual endeavor. But in the 19th century, there's a subtle shift. The question is still, what must I do in order to be righteous before God? The answer is, by the way, is you can do nothing, Christ does it all for you. But instead of the endeavor being intellectual and spiritual, it is now emotional and spiritual. So the religious movements that arise during the 19th century, such as the Second Great Awakening, Revivalism, Anxious Bench Evangelism, Anglo-Catholicism, all tend to be driven by a more emotional approach to Christianity. And this shift really rather altered the way in which Anglicanism perceived itself. In the 18th century, everyone who was an Anglican knew they had the Catholic heritage and the Reformed heritage. The High Churchmen tended to emphasize the sacramental side of Anglicanism. The Evangelicals tended to push the obvious evangelical musts, such as conversion, a serious approach to Christianity, a personal relationship with Christ, which they tended to find more through preaching than the High Churchmen, who found the same things more through sacraments. But in the 19th century, you have a sort of neo-medievalism going on. And particularly in Anglicanism, you have the replacement of the sort of liturgy that had come into being after the Reformation with something that is modeled on medieval forms. and this appeals to a different market. I think Patrick's smiling because he's not used to me talking about marketing. And as a result of this, you have a movement grow up within Anglicanism which conceives as Anglicanism as being primarily, in fact almost solely, Catholic, and the Reformation has been kind of an unfortunate bump along the way. In reaction to them, you get a very negative form of evangelicalism which emphasizes the Protestantism of Anglicanism and regards its inheritance from the medieval and the primitive churches as being an inconvenience. The first well-known dispensationalist, Darby, was one of the extreme Anglicans, extremist evangelical Anglicans, to come out of the 1820s. And he eventually became so extreme he fell off the Anglican wagon altogether and joined the Plymouth Brethren. In the same way, the exaltation of more emotional approaches to religion through medieval spirituality is something that is the driving force that turns Tractarianism into Anglo-Catholicism. The Tractarians are an odd bunch in that at their most moderate, by which I mean Isaac Williams and Tom Keeble, they scarcely say anything new. They line up with the very determined, old-fashioned high churchmen. On the other hand, Hurlfrud, Newman are all but Roman Catholic even before Newman finally goes over. So, you can't really talk about Anglo-Catholicism or Tractarianism. It's as a tightly defined theological unit. It is rather a general movement to emphasize the Catholicism of the English Church. And I'm not saying it wasn't needed, because just like the Lutheran Church in Germany, just like the Dutch Reformed, just like the Swiss Reformed, Anglicanism had had more than its fair share of pietism and rationalism in the previous generations. It needed a Catholic revival to restore the balance. The difficulty was not that it produced a Catholic revival, but that Catholic revival created a church within a church. And one of the problems that we inherit from the 19th century, and I'm sorry I've taken a very historical approach now, but one of the problems we inherit from the 19th century is that we don't have Anglicanism today. We have Anglicanisms. We have Anglo-liberalism or Anglo-revisionism. We have Anglo-Pentecostalism. We have Anglo-Catholicism. We have Anglo-liberalism. We have Anglo-evangelicalism, all of which claim to be Anglican, but all of which ignore some significant part of the Anglican inheritance. And one of the things that will be very important for the survival and the future prosperity of Anglicanism is to move away from this sort of internal sectarianism back towards a vision that integrates, as was the case in the 18th century, both the Catholic, i.e. sacramental, and evangelical, i.e. biblical, sides of Anglicanism. It isn't sufficient, to echo Peter Toon, to be Catholic at the altar and evangelical in the pulpit. You have to be Catholic and evangelical at the altar and Catholic and evangelical in the pulpit. We have to get the two sides of Anglicanism pulling together. One of the things that is extremely important is that we begin to understand that Anglicanism actually has a strong center. the most destructive effect of the 20th century on Anglicanism was the liberalization of the old middle of Anglicanism. The guys who looked both to Catholicism and Evangelicalism for their inspiration. The old, in America they used to get called broad church, which is a bit misleading because it implies they're liberal, and they really weren't. In England we call them central churchmen, the people who held, word and sacrament together. They didn't exalt word over sacrament or sacrament over word. And there's a real crying need for that to get back at the center of Anglicanism. One of the things that regularly appalls me about traditional Anglicanism is I run into people who basically don't know much about the Bible, because as much of the sum total of their engagement with the Bible has been the Sunday readings. Similarly, I'm always slightly unnerved by Anglicans who have no conception of the centrality of the sacraments in the life of the church. And we need to pull those two sides back together by understanding how word and sacrament work together to promote the salvation of humanity. And that, I hope, is something that I will draw out more over the next 8 weeks. Okay, question time.
I do. I got it, man. Listening to you tonight, and this is also probably for Father Paul Castellano, because it kind of goes back to a couple of your all's discussions, but nobody's ever mentioned this. So, I've read, in the 1500s, when Henry, before the English, we're talking about Catholic and Evangelical. Mm-hmm. But we talk about the Bible coming in English, and even in the court before it was legal, there was the English people were reading it. We know the nobility were able to read when it did come out in English. Mm-hmm. It was okay. And we do, we know there was a little more conversion on some of the stuff I've read of the nobility class as this Reformation comes. We know from Luther's readings, though, that he was very more preaching the gospel. Mm-hmm. But on the English church, you don't really get to really seeing the, preaching to the common people until you get to Whitefield, Wesley, and all those guys really preaching the gospel message. In the 1500s, was there really any conversion? I've never read anything, and maybe you guys can enlighten me, in the English church to the common folks that couldn't read. Even though you're reading the Bible, we got a new liturgy in English. Are we really doing the evangelical part?
The mere fact that you have a Puritan movement in England is the proof that evangelical, by which I mean Protestant principles, were getting through to the people. What you don't have in the 16th century is the sort of spectacular revivalist kind of ministry that you get with Whitefield and with Wesley. What you get is a very ordered Reformation. So even in parishes which did not have a licensed preacher, you get the homilies. The homilies set out the basics of evangelical doctrine. So what you get is what I would call a slow conversion. In other words, folks are absorbing the English Bible, the English liturgy, sermons, and homilies, all of which point to a firmly Reformed and evangelical understanding of Christianity. What you don't have in the 16th century, which is the background to Whitefield and Wesley in the 18th century, is the general neglect of religion that grows up under the influence of the Enlightenment at the beginning of the 18th century. The two, they're very different eras.
Your Grace, if I might just dovetail onto that.
Mm-hmm.
Father Patrick, if you look at that time frame, specifically as Cranmer, and I'm treading on your toes, Your Grace, so
Off you go.
look at that time frame, specifically with what Cranmer was trying to do. What you notice is his attempt to bring in from the continent individuals to further the, for lack of a better phrase, the evangelical cause. So what you have is you have not so much Butcher because his health started to go sideways, but you have Vermilion, you have
Lasky.
John Alasco, or you have Lasky. You have a number of people brought into the UK to minister the gospel in its evangelical form to local parishes that were being influenced by the Lutheran understanding of justification by faith. As His Grace said, it was very organized. It wasn't this outbreak that occurred within the culture as we saw a couple centuries later.
Yeah, it's Reformation from the top.
Now, let me ask you, I wanted to ask you,
It should have been.
the both of you, this other Pacific question. So we come out of Mary's reign and we go into Elizabeth's reign, and, you know, they kind of always talk about it somewhat still Catholic, and then still being, you know, moving, you know, the prayer book. I don't want to say evangelical because I don't know if that's the right word, but it was definitely more Protestant, but with Catholic. And is Peter Toon, is he really talking more something on that line of more of the Elizabethan time of the church before we switch over to James, and then the movement, you know, and then eventually you get into 1662s and you get the compromise? I mean, what does that part of the church have to do with what we're talking about in terms of Peter Toon and this divide of evangelicals, Catholics, and how did that relate in terms of also moving the church in the common folks? I just ask you both that because I'm really mute on the Elizabethan understanding of church, somewhat.
Okay, three things. The Elizabethan settlement was not a compromise between Catholic and Protestant. It is entirely a Protestant settlement. A few things, like the ornaments rubric, left room for some visual traditionalism. But in terms of its articles, in terms of its liturgy, in terms of its homilies, in terms of its theology, the Elizabethan Church aligns with the moderate Reformed on the continent. So Heidelberg, Strasbourg, before the Lutheran takeover in the 1550s, even the Dutch Reformed, the relatively the relatively moderate side, you know, not the John Knox side, the Ursinus side of the Reformed Church. 1662 does not significantly alter the settlement on paper. It clarifies a few things. It reintroduces the concept of an offertory. It reintroduces the manual acts into the prayer of consecration. But basically, you know, the Church of England didn't even get its hat blown off in terms of the final settlement that comes out of 1662. What I think Peter Toon is primarily concerned with is the disconnect which has grown up in the last 150 years between the Catholic and the evangelical sides of Anglicanism. And that is a large part of what he's trying to do in his book, The Anglican Way, and that's reconnect the two halves of Anglicanism together. Because the tendency is, if you are on the evangelical side, you gradually drift out into non-denominationalism. If you are on the Catholic side, you gradually drift towards old Catholicism or Orthodoxy if you don't go over to Rome. And if you look at some of the traditional Anglican churches that we have around us, you know, those without a strong engagement with the evangelical side of Anglicanism become increasingly old Catholic in ethos, to the point where they're running a razor blade down the back of the prayer book to get rid of the 39 articles. On the other hand, if you look at Church of England parishes that are involved with new wine and the various evangelical stroke charismatic movements that are going on at the moment, they lose any sense of the Catholic. And they, you know, increasingly conform themselves to the non-denominational model. So, you know, you've got a very loose, to the point of being almost non-existent form of liturgy. You know, you've got the reliance on information technology. You've got something that is not engaging with the traditional Catholic Church in any meaningful sense. And I think what Peter Toon is trying to do is say very clearly and very firmly there is a third way, where the Catholic feeds the evangelical feeds the Catholic, and what we get is the best of both worlds. And we do have this problem in Anglicanism of, you know, even amongst conservative Anglicans, the two sides have increasingly disconnected from one another.
So what I was just trying to get to the full root, because I understand the Tractarian movement and I actually understand the evangelical arguments and going through the whole Tractarian thing. I was just trying to figure out how to relate back to the early church if Peter Toon was really trying to relate back to something that was there that we lost from that early part, or did we really, it wasn't until the Tractarian movement and you kind of start seeing the Catholic pull that things kind of blended back? Is that what he was really saying, that we needed to do the, because I know he wrote his stuff on the tracts and I've read his stuff, but where was he really, I mean, where does he say that we needed to blend? Did we lose it in the beginning and we need to, tracts kind of went too far, but we needed to?
We lost it in the 19th century because increasingly the evangelicals and the Anglo-Catholics became parties that were closed in on themselves. I mean, even today, you only have to go on Facebook and look at the moaning and groaning that goes on. For instance, yesterday there was a photograph of the Bishop of Blackburn celebrating at the north end of the communion table. The Bishop of Blackburn happens to be an Anglo-Catholic, by the way. And you got all the snarky comments about, I hope there's an altar stone in that thing. Oh dear, why can't he face the proper direction? All that sort of thing. Because, you know, the two parties have really became very closed in on themselves. I mean, back in the 1950s, you used to get the catalogue from the favourite pub, the favourite church supply house of the English Church Union, the Anglo-Catholic representative group in the Church of England, that used to have a nice line in ironically named products such as Latimer and Ridley brand incense. And and this is how stupid and sectarian it became. On the other hand, you know, you had evangelicals who would flip an absolute fit at the sight of a single-breasted cassock, because that was identified as a mark of the Catholic movement. And what Peter Toon's trying to do is get behind the silliness to a more broadly based Orthodox Anglicanism, which acknowledges both its Catholic and its evangelical inheritance. And I don't think he has a particular problem with people being favouring one or favouring the other, provided they acknowledge the reality and attempt to be representative of both. Because that is the great danger of Anglicanism, with it having such a broad base. You know, it's easy not to engage with the whole thing. It's very easy just to say, oh, I like this, and gom on to that, and not look at anything else. The American church, strangely, apart from its little liberalism problem, has not had quite such a problem with the two sides disengaging with each other that the Church of England has had. Part of that is because the lack of parson's freehold over here meant that you didn't get entrenched eccentrics. You know, if they went too far and they upset the vestry, that was the end of them. Episcopal vestries have their ways of getting rid of rectors. We just hope they don't find out about too many of them. Similarly, there is a tendency in the American church that because there isn't an establishment over here, the tendency of established churches is to be inclusive and theologically ill-defined. The Episcopal Church in the USA was always a little sharper in its, I won't actually say theology, I think it's more a case of brand image, than Anglicanism in the UK. So you don't get the real extremes. You know, you don't have, you know, Father Jimmy at St. Silas using the Roman Mass in Latin, and there's not a blind thing the bishop can do with it on the one hand. By the same token, you don't have Mr. Jones at the other end of the street, you know, basically treating the prayer book and the 39 articles as being inferior to the Westminster formularies. Because in America, the two extremes would tend to follow the logic of their position and become either Roman Catholic or Presbyterian. So the tendency in America has always been, yes, we have our Anglo-Catholics, yes, we have our evangelicals, but they haven't really, to the same extent, forgotten that the other side exists. One of the things you get quite a lot in England from both Catholics and evangelicals is this sense, oh, I wish the other lot would go away and then the church would be perfect. But if that happened, it wouldn't be Anglicanism. Probably not a very satisfactory answer, but you know, best I can come up with. Okay, any more for any more? I shall try to be a little bit more on the point next week. We need to have, next week we'll be looking at chapter 3, where Toon starts on a subject beloved to me by grace alone. And you'll see by the organization, this is because Peter Toon comes from the evangelical side of Anglicanism. he talks first and foremost about the evangelical inheritance of Anglicanism, by grace alone and by faith alone. And then he starts talking about the Anglican experience of the Catholic Church. So, you know, what he's saying is, you know, doctrinally we embrace the Reformation, but we did so as a Catholic Church. Okay?
May I ask one quick question?
Sure.
I got disconnected there for a minute, but
I suddenly disappeared.
well, then I reappeared. Anyway, there is going to be here in Western New York in June, there's a big Polish National Catholic Cathedral here, and there's going to be a meeting. You know those four Anglican groups that signed their joint concordance, the ACA and the APA, and I guess they're meeting with the Polish National Catholics, and there's something they call a Union of Scranton. Yeah. Anyhow, they're having a big meeting in June of this year, and I was thinking of just taking a day off from my other job and just going over there and just sitting in and listening in just to see kind of what's going on there.
One of the things that will be really instructive about that is just how far the more Anglo-Catholic side of the continuum has progressed into an old Catholic position. Because when you look at the affirmation of St. Louis, what it does is it unlocks the door and it unbolts the door for the center of gravity in Anglicanism to move away from evangelical Catholicism towards the old Catholic movement. Because this is probably the point at which they're going to excommunicate me, so we'll get it over with. They reduce the authority of Scripture and increase the authority of the magisterium as represented by the fathers and councils of the Church and Holy Tradition. And this is something that is at variance with traditional Anglican theology. So somebody like, say, C.B. Moss, who is a staunch advocate of the Catholic version of Anglicanism, throughout his book on the Catholic faith, he still engages with the 39 Articles. And although, sometimes he takes them out of context, he's still engaging with them. But you'll notice in the affirmation of St. Louis that there is a provision there that says that all previous Anglican formularies must be interpreted in line with this affirmation. And that provides a means by which, you can shunt, switch the Reformation period into a siding and affirm an identity which is essentially Old Catholic. Not that there's too much wrong with the Old Catholics, but, the Union of Scranton, by the way, is the replacement for the Union of Utrecht.
Okay.
So that when Utrecht caught liberal Episcopalianism in the mid-1990s, the Union of Utrecht in Europe very rapidly moved towards the ordination of women and a more liberal line on divorce remarriage. I think one or two of the provinces are getting quite liberal on homosexuality.
Yes, they are.
Whereas the Polish National Catholics are far more conservative. They actually have a lot in common with conservative Anglo-Catholicism. So it's natural the two groups should talk to each other. But it is a manifestation of this tendency, of the Catholic side of Anglicanism, once it loses sight of its evangelical side, to more and more align itself with Old Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy. You see, Western Rite Orthodoxy is a manifestation of the same phenomenon. Most of them are Catholic-minded Anglicans who just kept getting more and more Catholic until they've tipped over into communion with the Patriarch of Antioch. There's nothing wrong with it, providing people don't bait and switch. If they're open about what's going on.
Father, in 2011, the precursor occurred in Brockton, Massachusetts, to what happened a couple of years ago. It was the worldwide, I put that in quotes, Conference on Continuing Anglicanism. If you go to my Vimeo account, I posted all of the plenary sessions in their entirety, unedited. So you will get to hear Marsh, Haverland, Grundorf, Hewitt. You'll get to hear all of them in their own words. There's even a brief exchange between myself and the bishops on the 39 articles, which is quite entertaining. David Justice got a big kick out of it while he watched me go through my gyrations. But that to say, if you want to prep, if it were up to me, I'd tell you don't waste your time. But if you want to go, you might want to listen to what they said 8 years ago, because nothing's changed. It's actually worse.
The sidebar of this is one of the reasons I am less engaged with ACC, APA, ACA, Diocese of the Holy Cross,
DHC,
than I used to be, is because there is this vision of Anglicanism which almost completely rejects the theological side of the English Reformation. They like the prayer book, they don't like the articles.
Now, I would have to correct you. They don't like the prayer book, they like the missal.
Yeah.
Yeah, and with being at the APA, being ACC, there is nothing left of Anglicanism
except the name.
Except for the name. And they do have parishes that still use the 28. But if it was the preference of the APA and the ACC, and I can't speak of the others, you'd be a full-out missal church, period.
Since we're qualifying everybody's statements, they want the missal for the Eucharist, but they want the prayer book for morning prayer.
Yeah. One of my unkind jokes is that Anglo-Catholics will fight to the death for the 1928 prayer book, provided they don't have to say Mass from it.
Well, what prompted me to bring this subject up is those of you who know me a little bit know that I was raised in a Russian Orthodox church, and I'm, reading the Bible as a young man is what, by God's grace, transformed my life, and I'm definitely on the Reformed side of Anglicanism, or have great respect for the 39 articles. But I was just thinking in terms of, I've met some of these people here or there, Marsh and Grundorf, and I thought, well, it certainly wouldn't hurt when we talk about the two different sides to at least show up and observe for a while and say hello. I was more, I know Father Paul Castellano, I'm not going to be heading in that direction at this point in my life, as far as I know.
Well, I can tell you, you're great, just a second. Since you specifically mentioned the 39 articles, that was the exchange that I had. And I'm not going to tell you the contents. If you're interested, you can listen to what I said. Here was the reaction, and you can see it on film, so I am not exaggerating. Haverland turned around, he turned his back on me and walked away. He didn't even engage my question, and it was to him that I presented the initial question. Marsh sat there and gave me the most convoluted answer on the place of the articles, which boiled down to historically contextualized.
Mm-hmm.
Grundhoff sat there, folded his hands, and as far as I was know, he was taking a nap during the entire time. And all Hewitt would tell me is, well, go read Father Rogers. Now, the bishop can tell you, I've got 31 different commentaries on the 39 articles. I've read them all. So they were dismissive, insulting, and patronizing when it came to the 39 articles. That's their attitude. And you can see it on film.
Would you be so kind as to send me an email of how I can link up to that? And
I'll send you the link. I'll send you the link.
Okay, good. That would be helpful to me, because I would find that interesting.
They're long. These guys, man, you think we can talk.
Yeah, well, we both have the advantage, Father, that we're both fairly rude, so we get a lot said in a short period of time.
But here's the thing, you can talk to them and they can never answer a question, and if you listen to them preach, you're not getting anything out of it either. So I've never figured out where all of them are. And it seems like they can talk, but it doesn't go anywhere.
Well, a lot of ecumenicism and a lot of unity talks down the years have been based on the avoidance of the elephant that is sitting in the room. And, you know, periodically we see things blow up. For example, you know, the marriage between the Evangelical Reformed Church and the Congregational, in England it was the Congregational Union, I forget what it was called over here. That particular marriage, the churches had similar theologies, similar ethoses, but when you put the two together, you know, eventually you ended up with, you know, blood on the mat. Because sooner or later, somebody went too far. Because the deeper theological issues were not discussed at the time of union. They were kind of put off until later. And very often what happens when two churches merge on a non-confessional basis is that a lot of the minor theological issues get put off until they become major problems. Even sometimes simple matters of ethos can cause problems. For example, if you come from a church tradition where the church council is dominant, and you find yourself in a church where the pastor is expected to be dominant, you can have an awful time adapting to that environment. So, you know, church unity often is achieved at the expense of clarity, the expense of orthodoxy, and very often is the triumph of goodwill over common sense. And this is what we saw, you know, 20 years ago, actually nearer 30, when the ACC and the old AEC merged. You know, it was a top-down merger. You know, the top all thought they got along famously, but when it came down to parish level, it was a case of it didn't work so well. And so, you know, you had the ACC and the AEC going in, and you had the ACC original province, the Holy Catholic Church, Anglican Rite, the Holy Catholic Church, Western Rite, the Anglican Province of America, and the ACA all came out of that union, because they didn't cross the I's and dot the T's. I know I said that funny. Before the union took place, they just came up with a scheme, imposed it, and then it didn't work out because they hadn't studied it, they hadn't talked about it, they hadn't communicated it sufficiently with the parishes and with the clergy. Just saying. Okay, I think I've beat that one to death. We shall pick up again with By Grace Alone next week.